And so I'd like to introduce Tim Barton. He and his father, I would argue, are the nation's foremost experts on the founding era. And so you are going to, listen, strap in, put your seatbelts on. If you've never listened to Tim or his father, you know they talk really, really fast. We asked Tim to slow it down, only, come down about 10 miles an hour from where he's normally at. But we're gonna get a lot of information tonight, and we're grateful to have him. So Tim, come on up, welcome.
Thanks, Ken. Appreciate you, brother. Thank you. Well, thank you guys so much. It is my pleasure to be with you tonight. We'll try to slow down a little bit, but there's a lot to say, so we still are gonna go fast. And can we get slides up? Perfect. We're gonna talk a little bit about American history tonight. And for those of you who maybe aren't familiar with our organization, we do a lot with American history. We have what's considered to be the largest private collection of original artifacts from American history. We have more than 160,000 items and artifacts from American history. And so what we're gonna talk about tonight, actually, we have a lot of original sources to verify what we are saying. And so even as we get into this, one of the things that we tell people often now is as we have a conversation tonight, I'm gonna tell you some stories, we're gonna go over some details, and I would encourage you, don't take my word on anything I say. The reason is, one of the challenges we're dealing with in America is for too many decades, we've trusted whoever was on the news, right? Whatever was posted on social media or in an email, and I'm just telling you, we need to wake up and realize somebody needs to start investigating and doing some research and studying for themselves, but I also can tell you I'm not scared of being challenged or questioned because I've done the research and know what truth is. And truth is never scared of being questioned. Lies don't want to be questioned because they don't want to be exposed. I don't mind you fact checking me. I want you to fact check me because I want you to find the truth for yourself. And as we start off, I'm going to go back to something, George Orwell, his book 1984, if you haven't read it, it's kind of shocking in the factual accuracy of where we are today, but he said in it, whoever controls the past controls the future, whoever controls the present controls the past. And let me break this down. He said, whoever controls the present controls the past. Well, right now, we're seeing the people in charge of the education system, they're controlling the narrative that's being told about the past, right? With like the 1619 Project saying, well, America was founded to protect slavery, and then the narrative is being shaped by who controls the present. Whoever controls the present controls the past. But why does that even matter that the past is being redirected? Because as he pointed out, whoever controls the past controls the future, right? Where the past is the course that's being headed for the future. So if America was a fundamentally racist, awful, evil nation, America's always been terrible and never done any good, then America needs to be torn down and fundamentally changed. Right? So the way you view the past will determine the trajectory you have for the future. This is why this matters and why history matters, because whoever controls the past controls the present, whoever controls the present controls the future. And in the midst of this, some of what we are seeing happen in our culture today goes back to someone like Howard Zinn, when he did his book called A People's History of the United States. And Howard Zinn's book, which by the way, has largely been discredited on all kinds of levels now, even leftist professors acknowledge this was very bad history, but Howard Zinn argued that America is defined by all of her evil moments. And America went from one evil moment to the next, and he starts with like Christopher Columbus. And Columbus was evil, and really, a lot of the things we are hearing today were espoused by Howard Zinn, and he wasn't really maybe the first guy to say all this, but he really culminated it together, and that shaped a lot of the things we are dealing with today. And part of it is this notion of deconstruction, and deconstruction is a kind of idea, philosophy that you need to tear down the existing or the status quo. So whatever is there right now, you need to tear it down. It's also part of a Marxist ideology, where in Marxism, in order to overthrow, right, who is in charge now, you have to make everything about America and what made America special and great, you have to paint that in the light that America was evil and America is the oppressive nation, and you have to paint the picture that everybody else was victimized because you have the oppressor and the oppressors, and this is the way the narrative is being shaped, but that's part of what deconstruction is. Now, the reason I bring this up is one really easy example to point to is just a couple weeks ago, we had Columbus Day, except if you look actually at the White House, they didn't celebrate Columbus Day. President Biden issued the very first ever proclamation to celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day. Let me be very clear. I have no problem acknowledging the contributions of indigenous people or Indians or natives, however we define that, right? Here's what I want to point out though. The argument is we shouldn't celebrate Columbus because he's evil, but we should celebrate all of these Native American tribes. Let me just ask real quick a question. When we're celebrating Indigenous Peoples Day, are we celebrating like all the indigenous people or just certain tribes? Because if you aren't real familiar with indigenous people, not like the way that Disney portrayed the picture was like Native people are peaceful and they just paint with the colors of the wind. I would point out, if you study history, that's not what all natives did, right? There were some very fierce, savage tribes that did some extreme violence and harm to other native tribes, to everybody they came in contact with. So really, if we're gonna have indigenous people, we can't have Columbus Day because that's bad. We're gonna have Indigenous Peoples Day. Like, there's just some inconsistencies with this thought and logic. And again, I have no problem saying we ought to celebrate some of the contributions of Native Americans. I love that idea. But we're gonna cancel Columbus and we're pretending like all Native Americans were these amazing, awesome people. There's just a little convoluted thought in this and it's inconsistent. And let me point out, one of the things about Columbus, if you look up articles on Columbus today, it is very consistent that you will find articles about how bad or evil or whatever Columbus might be. There's a lot of negative things about Columbus that are said today. In fact, if you look around the nation, around the world, there's been more than 600 statues erected to Christopher Columbus, but almost every one of those statues has been vandalized, torn down, or destroyed on some level. So more than 600 statues erected around the world to Columbus, and almost all of them now have been defaced. And it really is worth asking the question, by the way, side note, I'm not in favor of tearing down any statue or monument pretty much ever. The reason is, if someone was awful, evil, and terrible, you should use the statue to talk about how awful, evil, and terrible they were. If you tear down the statue, you are removing a great teaching opportunity. You see, you don't remove history, you teach history. We learn from history what is there. With that being said, I'm not in favor of tearing down statues. I'm not in favor of defacing statues, but this one is actually kind of impressive on some level. Again, I'm not condoning it, but I don't know how you got a hatchet stuck in a statue. Right, like that's actually impressive on some level. Again, I'm not condoning it, but it's interesting. Okay, nonetheless, this is the consistent thing we see with Columbus. Now, here's an important question is why have there been these statues up for hundreds of years that were never attacked and defaced, and over the last couple of years, what have we discovered that was brand new information that nobody knew before us about how Columbus was evil? And generally what we are told today is, well, Columbus was bad because of slavery and because of genocide to the natives. This is what we're generally told today. Now, if Columbus actually did enslave all the natives, if he actually did kill all the natives, then maybe Columbus is a little more thug than most people realized, right? And so maybe like there's a reason that people want to cancel him. Here's what I would ask though. What do most Americans know about Columbus? There's only actually one thing most Americans know about Columbus. The one thing we know about Columbus is actually in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, right? Does anybody remember that? Like, remember, right? So that's the thing that most people know about Columbus. Here's my follow-up question. If Columbus was evil, which voyage was he evil on? The reason that matters is most people don't know he took more than one voyage. Columbus actually took 4 voyages. So if Columbus committed genocide, if he enslaved the natives, did he do it on the first voyage or was it the second or third or fourth? And the reason I ask that is if you don't know what he did on those voyages, how do you know what's being told is even true? This is where it's worth learning the story to find out, was this guy a bad guy or is somebody misportraying who he is and what he did? So let me just walk you through this real quick. If you look at Columbus's first voyage, it was a voyage of discovery. And in the midst of this, remember, he's an Italian guy. He's trying to find someone to fund what he wants to do. He actually thinks he's gonna sail around the world because they were trying to find trade routes. At this point, there were Islamic jihads happening and the intercontinental trade routes that would go from Europe to Asia. And so the land trade routes weren't navigable very well. And Columbus said, well, instead of like sailing all the way around Africa, why don't we just sail around the world? He believed it was a globe. Now, he thought it was much smaller than it is. He didn't know there was a continent in the way, but he said, let's just sail around it. So he's finding someone to hopefully fund this expedition. The Spaniards do it, so he's sailing for the Spanish. And when he lands with these 3 ships, right, one of the things that's very interesting is they actually encounter a native tribe. The native tribe he encounters is the Taino tribe. And the Taino tribe, Columbus actually wrote back to the king and queen and said, these people are amazing. Now, they were very friendly. They traded. They worked very well together. But here's one of the things Columbus wrote back to the king and queen. He said, your highnesses may believe that there is no better nor gentler people in the world. Your highnesses ought to rejoice that they will soon become Christians and that they will be taught the good customs of your kingdom. A better race there cannot be. Now today people argue that Columbus was this racist, terrible guy. Let me just point out, if you're saying a better race there cannot be of this native tribe, that doesn't sound like a really racist white guy thing to say, right? I mean, it just seems odd that he would say that if he really was a racist. Let me also point out, in their interaction and exchange with the Taino, one of the things that happened, they had 3 ships, right? The Nina, Pinta, Santa Maria, and one of the ships ran aground. And because it ran aground, they couldn't get it off, it couldn't sail back. Well, Columbus only had 2 ships now to sail back. Columbus had to leave some of his men behind. And the Taino said, hey, it's no problem. We'll actually show them a place where there's fresh water. They can stay here on the island. Columbus and his men, they help build a fort, and they're gonna leave some of their men behind. And before Columbus leaves, the Taino say, by the way, we're not the only tribe on this island. They say there's another tribe, and this is a really mean tribe. They actually have attacked us many times, and apparently they showed Columbus like scars on their body from some of these wars they had with this other tribe. And they told Columbus, this other tribe actually eats people. And you can read in Columbus's journal, because Columbus doesn't really believe it. He's like, no, this is the 1400s. People don't eat people, right? Like that doesn't happen. Columbus goes and he sails back. His second voyage, he comes to America. He comes with 17 ships, approximately 1,200 men. And actually during this voyage, again, you can read his writings. He actually told the king and queen that there's a lot of people on this voyage who are not fitting of the title or the name Christian because they're terrible people. They have bad behavior. Well, Columbus acknowledged not all these people were good people. Nonetheless, the king and queen said, hey, that's who's going. Your job is to lead them. Don't worry about everybody else. So Columbus leads this group back. When they get back, they actually land on a different island. And he's credited with discovering America. Really, he discovered islands off of America, but it let people know there was land over this way that they finally discovered America. Anyway, side note, he lands on a different island than the first island. When they landed on that second island, he realizes, hey, we have men. We left on this first island back at the fort. We should go back and check on our men. So they get on a ship, they go to check on the men. When they get to the first island, they find the fort has been destroyed, burned down, and they find all of their men's bodies, all of them dead on the beach, and they've been cannibalized. Okay, now, put yourself in Columbus' shoes for a second, right? You're like, what just happened? Because you think people don't eat people. And all of a sudden you see people like missing parts of their body and flesh and they've been eaten and you're going, this is crazy. Well, he gets very angry, understandably so. You've just seen the bodies of your men who were eaten. So he goes looking for who did this. The Taino come to him and they say, hey, it wasn't us, but we tried to tell you there's another tribe. The other tribe was known as the Caribbee tribe. The Caribbee is where the word Caribbean comes from. They were also known as the Cannib tribe, which is where the word cannibal comes from. They said that other tribe came, they attacked your men, and we actually came over and tried to help them. They turned and attacked us, and they actually killed some of us, and they kidnapped some of our women. And Columbus was like, where are they? And the Taino were like, we would love to show you because we would love for you to deal with these guys. In fact, the Taino joined Columbus, and logically, Columbus had a lot of men, and he had the boom boom sticks, and the Taino were like, we want to be your teammates. It would be like me just wanting to be on LeBron's basketball team, right? Can I just be on your team? This is gonna be awesome. I will be doing nothing, but I just wanna be on the winner's team. This is what the Taino do. They join with Columbus. They actually find one of these Caribbee villages. Columbus attacks the Caribbee village, and as they attack the village, they conquer the village. And at the end, there were some Caribbee men who were still alive. And so Columbus's men capture these survivors, and these are the first natives that Columbus ever approved of enslaving. And what's worth noting, this is at the end of a war that Columbus did not start, okay? This is a justified war in just war theory. This was a defensive war. Columbus didn't start this war, but he went in defense of his men who had been killed and eaten, and they conquered a people in the 1400s, in the era of conquest. If one people group conquers another people group, there's only 2 options for the survivors. You either kill them or you enslave them, right? This wasn't Columbus's idea. This was the way of the world. It was the 1400s in the era of conquest. But here's what's crazier, is not only did they defeat the Caribbee tribe in this specific village, they actually found in that village there were 49 huts. And all of these huts actually were locked from the outside and there were people inside. So they go and start unlocking these huts, and all of these huts had women inside. It's interesting, in these huts, There's actually records, Columbus, when he was on this voyage, there were 2 medical doctors with him. There are records from both the medical doctors, or records from Columbus of what happened. I'm gonna read you part of the record from one of the medical doctors who was with Columbus explaining what they saw and what happened. Here's part of the record. It says, as soon as these women learned that we abhor such kind of people because of their evil practice of eating human flesh, they felt delighted. They well knew they were safe in our company, right? So first thing, when the women that they let out of the hut found out that Columbus and his men were not cannibals, they're like, whew, I'm so glad, because we were a little nervous about you. That says something about the culture they lived in, right? When you're afraid the warring tribe is gonna eat you. Like, that's just interesting to begin with, but the record continues. It said, these captive women told us that the Caribbean men used them with such cruelty as would scarcely be believed, and that they eat the children which they bear to them. The Caribbean men, when they would conquer other tribes, they would bring women back and they would use the women for a breeding farm to raise up more food, which was humans. I want to point out, okay, this was not totally unique of the Caribbean, because archaeologists, different anthropologists, people that have gone back and done research, they acknowledge, actually, when you look back, there's a lot of records from some of these native tribes, actually North, Central, South America. Every single native tribe prior to Columbus actually had cannibalism as part of their culture, either for dietary means or for ritual worship, for sacrifice to a god, right? Like the Aztecs, they worship the sun god and they would sacrifice humans as worship to the sun god. This is something that archaeologists, that historians, it's now well documented. These are actually drawings and images from them actually eating people taken from those cultures. Here's the point. When people say, yeah, but Columbus enslaved the natives. Which natives? The ones who killed and ate his men, right? Like, I obviously recognize slavery's awful, it's not good, it's bad, shouldn't happen. But when you read history, every now and then you read about a people group and you're like, if anybody should have been enslaved, right? I feel like this is probably a group of people that, probably let's just take them off the radar a little bit. This is the reality of, this is the first people that Columbus ever approved enslaving. It's worth noting. In Columbus's 4 voyages, he never approved enslaving any native that was not captured in a justified warfare, meaning a war that they did not start where natives attacked them, because this wasn't the only tribe that did this. But this was the most famous tribe where this event happened. Now that's his 2nd voyage. After he returns from his 2nd voyage, he then gets approval again. He's going on a 3rd voyage. And this time he begged the king and queen, please, I want to be governor so bad. And the king and queen finally acquiesced. They said, okay, you can be the governor, it's fine. Well, he was the governor of this Spanish group of islands. The problem was he was Italian. And when he landed this 3rd time, he's their governor. He tells them, hey guys, good news, I'm your governor. They're not really impressed. But Columbus is an explorer at heart. And so he leaves that island and he goes, starts exploring other islands, and he comes back to this main colony island where most of civilization is. And when he gets back on that island, he finds that these Spaniards have actually started not only enslaving people who had done nothing wrong, but they were raping women, they were murdering people. And Columbus says, no way. Columbus takes people who had been doing these incredible crimes, Columbus publicly executes them in front of the other Spaniards. Here's the problem. When you have an Italian governor executing Spaniards in front of other Spaniards in a Spanish colony, the other Spanish people weren't largely pleased with this, and there was a revolt on the island. They actually captured Columbus, they put him in chains, and they wrote back to the king and queen, and they said, hey, this man is awful, he's killing, he's murdering, he's raping. They accused him of everything they had done themselves. Well, Columbus has to go back before the king and queen to stand trial for all of these crimes he's allegedly committed. On the journey back, Columbus journaled a lot. So you can read a lot of these things in his journal. And he wasn't the only one who wrote these things down. There's a lot of other people, a crew who were there, who write some of these things as well that are consistent with what he wrote. But Columbus identified, as he was going back, he said that he was praying and asking God for deliverance. But here's part of what he wrote in his journal. But God is above, who with so much wisdom and power rescued Daniel and the 3 children, and who, if he please, can rescue me with a similar manifestation of his power. Okay, Columbus knew that, okay, I'm gonna have to have God's help. Like Daniel in the lion's den, if God doesn't show up, I'm in trouble. Well, he gets back before the king and queen and he tells them what actually happened. And the king and queen realize that he's being honest, and they exonerate him of every charge. They declare him innocent of every charge. And today it's crazy. Almost everything that people say about Columbus that's negative are the charges that he was found to be innocent of those charges. Okay, that's just an interesting side note worth noting. Now, he does get approval to go on a fourth voyage. But the fourth voyage, the king and queen say, hey, you can go back, we'll fund your voyage, but you don't need to be governor anymore. That was not a good scenario as this, right, Italian over the Spanish. We're gonna have one of our Spanish guys be governor. So this fourth voyage, he goes, it's a pretty direct voyage. He actually gets shipwrecked for a while, but he comes back, and when he gets back, he dies shortly after returning after his fourth voyage. There's been a couple guys who have done very extensive biographies on him. One of the most famous biographers of Columbus was a guy named Morrison. And in Morrison's biography, he summarized what Columbus dealt with and kind of who he was as a person. Here's what Morrison wrote to describe Columbus. He was a man alone with God against human stupidity and depravity, against greedy conquistadors, cowardly seamen, even against nature and the sea. This is what Columbus was dealing with. Now, I can quickly acknowledge Columbus wasn't perfect. Nobody is, right? As a Christian, I believe that everybody is jacked up and they need Jesus, right? Like that's my starting place, okay? I believe everybody's messed up. That's why Jesus came, because nobody's perfect. So I'm not arguing Columbus is perfect. I can point to some mistakes that I think he made. I can point to some bad moments or sinful moments in his life. The point is, though, is almost everything said about him, historically, he's not actually guilty of what most of the things he's accused of today. And this is where certainly like these notions, well, Columbus is an evil guy. Okay, we've heard of this notion of like fake news. I can tell you there's also like fake history. This is not a true thing about Columbus. Columbus is actually a very honorable person, because also worth noting, you always judge people in the context of the time of which they live, okay? In the era of Columbus, name a more honorable explorer who treated the natives better than Columbus, and you can't find one. Columbus was not perfect, but he was one of the best guys of his generation with what he did, his behavior, everything else. But see, we can look at him and go, well, we wouldn't do that today, so he's bad. Okay, I mean, it's kind of fair because I get the thought, but you judge them in the era of the time in which they lived to understand the context of what they're dealing with. The point is, Columbus was not guilty of most of what he's accused of today, but this goes back to what we're doing in education is actually kids are learning that America's fundamentally evil and like the people involved in America were evil. So the College Board is the one that does the ACT and the SAT. They're also the ones who largely do the AP courses in public school. And right, the AP courses is arguably where like the smart kids go when they take these AP courses. And if you do well in the AP course and you get credit for it in college, and so you have that class done with in college. What's crazy about these AP courses is there's a lot of agenda-driven stuff in these AP courses. For example, if you look at US history, there's 162 pages that are the curriculum for US AP history. Okay, so this is US history, AP standards, and what is crazy about this is when you look back at some of these standards and what they have promoted on American history, it's staggering what they don't include and things they don't think kids need to know about. For example, they don't include Jefferson or Franklin or John Adams or Madison, like some significant founding fathers. They don't include things about the American Revolution. They don't include any of the major battles or major moments in the Revolution. And it's not just Revolution. If you jump forward to the Civil War, they don't include things about Lincoln, whether it be the Emancipation Proclamation or the Gettysburg Address, or even the fact that he was assassinated, or they don't even include the major people of the Civil War, the major generals in the Civil War. So like all of this is overlooked if you go to World War II, the major battles of World War II, like starting with Pearl Harbor. Why did we get involved? Pearl Harbor, we were bombed. They don't include the major battles of World War II or the generals of World War II. So like kids are literally taking this course learning about World War II without these guys who were the heroes, and they don't even learn about the bad guys of World War II. In the AP standards, there was no mention of Hitler. There was no mention of the Holocaust. This is in the AP standards. Okay, now, this is what the smartest kids in school are learning, or maybe in this case are not learning. Okay, now, if this is all stuff that's left out, it was worth asking the question, then what are we teaching? Now, let me point out, some of this is from the 2014 standards. There was such an outcry that in the American history standards, they actually did add a couple of paragraphs and pages so that the new standards actually do include the word Hitler and the word Holocaust. Okay, it still doesn't include Pearl Harbor, doesn't include D-Day or Normandy or Battle of the Bulge, doesn't include right the Pacific Theater. Like it still leaves out the vast majority of things, but what are we teaching kids? One of the things included to this day in the AP history standards is if you look at the atomic bombs, one of the things that students are taught today is that the decision to drop the atomic bomb raised questions about American values. Okay, hang on. What question did it raise about American values? Well, it was a really big bomb and it killed a lot of people and America shouldn't have dropped a really big bomb. Okay, before we started any bombing raids, not like even the atomic bomb, before we started any bombing raids, you know what we dropped before we dropped bombs? We dropped leaflets. In fact, the US government identifies we dropped over 70 million leaflets in Japan. And on these leaflets, we actually own dozens of these original leaflets. And on these leaflets, on the back of them in Japanese, it says that we are coming to bomb military and military support facilities. And bombs have no eyes, and we don't want people to be hurt who are innocent bystanders. So get away from these facilities. In fact, encourage the emperor to surrender. And we identified these specific towns that were targets in our bombing raids. It's actually documented that American pilots were furious about this because they said, you're telling them where we're going and they're gonna move all the anti-aircraft weapons to those cities. Like, this is a terrible thing to do, except we said we don't wanna hurt any civilians. Not only did we drop leaflets, when we took the island of Saipan, we took a radio station. It was KSAI, and from this station, every 15 minutes in Japanese, we broadcast into Japan, telling them the same thing the leaflet said, telling them we're coming to bomb these military support facilities. We're trying to end the war, encourage your emperor to surrender. And we actually told them the cities we were targeting and told them, get out of those cities. This is actually what we did. So this notion that it raised questions of American values. Okay, you only can make that statement if you don't actually know the story of what happened. Not only that, if you look at the atomic bombs, when the atomic bombs were dropped, about 150,000 people died from the explosion from both these bombs, and about 150,000 people died from radiation from these bombs. So about 300,000 total died from these bombs. However, Harry Truman, the reason he decided to drop these bombs was when we are at the place where we are now focusing on Japan. Germany's already surrendered, Italy's already surrendered, Japan has no allies left, but they refuse to give up. They refuse to surrender. So Harry Truman says, okay, what do we need to do? And he had military advisors say, we might need to do a land invasion like we did in Europe. And if we do a land invasion, his military officer said, understand this could be a high casualty scenario. Because in Japan, they had military Shintoism, which, right, their belief it was honorable to die for your country, for your ancestors. Like, that's a really good thing to do. You never surrender, you never give up. And so Truman said, okay, so if we invade, what's it gonna cost? And they said, well, it could cost between 5 and 10 million Japanese lives before they surrender. And to get that many lives, it would be between 2 to 4 million Allied lives and maybe 1 million American lives. So it could be up to 15 million lives lost if we do a land invasion. And Harry Truman says, well, do we have any other options? And they said, well, sir, last week, we had the first successful test of this really big bomb. And Truman says, well, let's try the really big bomb. So they dropped the really big bomb, the atomic bomb. In fact, one of the guys who was the navigator on the Enola Gay, his name was Dutch von Kirk. We have several letters from Dutch von Kirk, actually some signed photographs of what they were doing on that flight. And Dutch von Kirk said, people have forgotten why we dropped the atomic bombs. We dropped the atomic bombs to end the war and to save lives. And before we dropped the bombs, we dropped millions of leaflets, which were largely ignored. Okay, this is very important context because if you understand the distinction here, 15 million people versus 300,000. Now, 300,000, obviously, anytime people die, like that's not a good day, generally speaking. Okay, that's not a good scenario. However, when you look at the contrast of the other options, that's not a bad option, but we're not telling the history. We're not telling the truth of what happened. And let's also point out this notion that it raised questions of American values. Military historians have also documented in Japan, okay, in the midst of their military Shintoism, a lot of people don't understand what the Pacific Theater really looked like, right? What happened to American sailors and soldiers and Marines in the midst of this, or what the Japanese were even doing at that point to the Chinese or the Koreans, right? The Japanese executed more than 10 million Chinese. Like there were so much things. Now, obviously I'm saying at that time, right? Obviously it's not who Japan is anymore, which is a side note we'll come to in a minute. But in the midst of this, there are military historians who have documented that in one prisoner of war camp that they've identified specifically, the Japanese beheaded more people than both atomic bombs killed. In one prisoner of war camp. But what we are telling today is, well, we need to question American values because we dropped a really big bomb. See, this is this notion that we talked about, the idea of deconstruction, that we're saying, well, we're just gonna talk about how bad America is. One of the major problems is there are a lot of bad moments in American history because American history is filled with people and people don't always do the right thing, right? So I can point to really, really bad moments in American history where really bad and evil things happen. The problem now is we're actually lying about American history, trying to make it even more evil than what the evil moments were in some of those scenarios. And this is where what we are seeing is a very direct push to try to change the narrative of America. And that's why if you look at different states, every so many years they'll review their history standards. This last year, actually earlier this year, Minnesota and their state legislature, they actually passed a new law where they said, we're gonna change the way we teach American history in our public schools now. And what they decided was there were some things from American history they should remove. They said kids don't need to learn about this anymore. What they thought should be removed were things like the American Revolution, the Civil War, World War I, World War II, and the Holocaust. They said that should not be taught to students anymore. By the way, the legislature passed it and the governor signed it into law. That is now law in Minnesota, that students will no longer learn that in schools in that state. And Minnesota is not the only woke state doing that. Okay, there are other states moving that direction. And the reason I bring this up is because what are you then going to teach? They say, well, we want students to know about systemic slavery, systemic racism, systemic oppression, right? White, all these, like everything they're doing is wokeness. They say, we'll use 1619 as our curriculum, we'll use critical race theory. This is actually in their legislation of what they are doing. And what we are actually doing is changing the entire narrative. And this is something that is absolutely under this Marxist ideology. This is exactly what Marxism encourages and teaches. And in the midst, by the way, of critical race theory, it's just in case anybody has not made the connection yet, critical theory is what came out of Marxism. And critical theory taught that you have only two classes of people. Either you are an oppressor or you are oppressed, right? And so this was the idea, and actually in Marxism they said that we need to encourage all of the oppressed people to rise up and overthrow the oppressor, and the more you can encourage the oppressed to rise up and overthrow the oppressor, the better it will be, but you always need to overthrow the oppressor. And Marx actually said that sometimes you have to help teach people they're oppressed, because sometimes they don't know, so you have to tell them they're oppressed. Critical theory was actually tried in America. In the early 1900s, it was. The problem was critical theory was based on a monetary theory, an economic theory. And it was based on the fact that if you were poor, you're oppressed. And if you were wealthy, you're an oppressor. The problem was with using that theory in America, there's too much fluidity in station economically, where you can be born in utter poverty and in a matter of 40 years, you can be very successful and wealthy in America, because that's part of what happens in free market and capitalism, right? That's part of one of the greatness of the economic system of America. And so it didn't work in America, this critical theory. So in the 1960s, they said, well, what if we change the notion of critical theory, and instead of it being like about money, what if it was about race? So critical race theory was introduced, and it's been around for a long time, and it's never taken hold really until the last decade or two. It started growing in colleges and growing. But a lot of people have no idea. Again, this is from Marxism. Why does it matter? Marxism is the ideology that in the 20th century alone is responsible for more than 100 million deaths, right? You can look at Mao. You can look at Stalin. Look at these people, what they did to their own nations under this ideology of Marxism. And as Americans, because we're generally so ignorant of history, we don't recognize this ideology and what it actually produces, not to mention how unbiblical it is on so many levels. But let me just point out, there's a lot of movements out there today that are embracing this narrative of wokeness. And actually, it's even crazy when you look at some of the slogans for this. One of the slogans is rioting, rebellion, and radicalization. When that is your motto, let me suggest you have some problems, right? Because I remember growing up different mottos, like treat other people the way you want to be treated, right? Do unto others, you would have them do unto you. I remember some different mottos when I was growing up. What we are doing now is embracing this Marxist ideology. And again, this is what critical race theory is. And also to clarify, in the midst of critical race theory, there are a lot of people that debate, well, that's not critical race theory. Well, this is. There's been a lot of people that have written about this, tried to define it. Let me just read part of an article that I think did a really good job of explaining this. They said, it takes as a starting point that America was founded to protect and preserve slavery, and that the American constitutional system is the source of our society's ills, foremost among them being racism. So notice, what is the foremost problem? It's racism. Well, what has produced racism? They acknowledge it's the American constitutional system. That's the source of racism. The American constitutional system. So if that's what's racist, what we should do is get rid of the American constitutional system. That is the move happening right now. Okay, this is why if you look up right now on the National Archives, on their website and you go looking for the Declaration, the Constitution, or the Bill of Rights, you know what they put on the website before you see that document? They put a warning. This is the warning. Harmful language alert. National Archives puts warning on the US Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. Harmful language alert. The documents that have brought more freedom, more stability, more prosperity, or more equality than anywhere else in the world, and we're saying, oh, harmful language alert. And let me unfold some of this. Because part of the reason they say this is because we have been taught for the last several decades that what these guys did, these guys were told they were racist, and because they're racist, like what they did was really, really bad. Let me unpack that bag for a second, okay? If you go back to the Declaration of Independence, not many people know much about the Declaration, so let me give you the Reader's Digest breakdown. The Declaration was where we separated from Great Britain, we separate from the king, and we're gonna be our own nation. But here's the way really, maybe it's easier understood. The Declaration was the greatest breakup letter ever written. In this breakup letter, we said it's not us, it's all you. And we listed 27 reasons in the Declaration why the king was the problem. In the Declaration, right? The Declaration was primarily drafted by Thomas Jefferson, who was 33 years old at the time. And it's kind of a young guy doing this, but he writes brilliantly things in it. And let me point out things that we probably remember from the Declaration. Let me read you part of this. He said, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just power from the consent of the governed. In the midst of this, let me point out, the founding fathers agreed to this, but what they agreed to, what Jefferson wrote, he starts off this statement saying, we hold these truths to be self-evident. We live in a culture that doesn't think truth even exists anymore, right? That truth is how I feel on whatever given day. That's why I can use whatever bathroom I want, however I feel that day. Like truth doesn't exist for much of culture anymore. The founding fathers, and by the way, if truth doesn't exist, it's gonna be really hard to function as a society. Right, it's really hard to make that work if we can't agree on what truth is, okay? But they said, here are some basic truths we agree to. Number one, we are created equal. Number two, we have God-given rights. Number three, government exists to protect those rights. And actually, Jefferson, when he wrote this, he said these truths are self-evident. Self-evident means obvious. Let me point out, these truths are not actually self-evident for most of the world. The notion that we're created equal, do you know in India, they still have a class system today? Still, right? If you look in any major Muslim nation where they follow Sharia law, you understand they don't believe that men and women are equal, right? They don't believe that people that have a different religious belief are equal. Like most of the world doesn't believe in equality the way that we think equality should exist, okay? Or this idea that we have God-given rights. Do you think in China, they believe you have God-given rights? Do you think in Russia, right? Or like literally, we could pick a lot of nations. Right now, the Taliban in Afghanistan, do you think they believe you have God-given rights? No. I think there's a lot of political leaders in Washington, D.C. right now who don't think you have God-given rights, right? Because they think the government is the one who tells you what you can and can't do, right? This is not self-evident to most people in the world. Or the idea that government exists to protect your rights, that government is here to serve you. No. There's a lot of politicians who think we are here to serve them. Right? They think government is God, not like God is God. Government is God, and therefore it's above. So we're not here to serve you. Here's the point. These are not self-evident truths to most people. They're only self-evident truths to people who understand basic biblical values. It just so happened in our nation at that time, most founding fathers understood most of these basic biblical values. But one of the things today where people argue, wait a second, but no, the founding fathers were racist because when Jefferson wrote that all men were created equal, he didn't actually believe that because slavery, okay? That's the argument. Let me tell you, you should go back and read the original draft of his declaration. The original draft of the Declaration of Independence was 4 pages. You actually can get online and read all 4 of these pages. What is significant? When he actually in the original draft of the Declaration goes through and lists all of the problems we have with the king, the biggest grievance, the biggest problem he identified right here, this grievance was a grievance against the slave trade and slavery. And let me just read you part of what Jefferson said against the king in this grievance. He said, he, meaning the king, He has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating his most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. This piratical warfare, the opprobrium of infidel powers, is the warfare of the Christian king of Great Britain. Now, notice when he says Christian, right, it's underlined. If you actually read the original text, it was printed and it was not done in cursive. So this is like the air quotes, right? Like this Christian king of Great Britain, this king who says he's a Christian, clearly not following those ideas. He said this Christian king of Great Britain, determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold. In the original draft of the Declaration, that word men is fully capitalized and it is bolded. Why does this matter? Who is he talking about? The Africans on the slave ships. He said, these men. Why does this matter? When Jefferson wrote that all men were created equal, he already defined who men was. And the men weren't just the white people, it was everybody. This grievance is not done, by the way. Let me keep reading. It says, he has prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or restrain this execrable commerce. Hold up. The king struck down every legislative attempt? Yes. In the 1770s, there were 4 colonies who passed laws against the slave trade and against slavery. In 1774, the king vetoed all of those laws. And the king said, you can't end the slave trade. You can't end slavery. You're British colonies. Slavery is part of the British system. You can't end slavery. And actually, Pennsylvania was one of those states that actually passed a law against the slave trade. And when the king vetoed their law, Benjamin Franklin, among others, but he's a notable founding father, Benjamin Franklin said, this is just one more reason we should separate from the king because he won't even let us end slavery in our own colony. Oh, that's interesting. See, a lot of people don't know the actual history of what happened, or like this notion that, right, the founding fathers had agreements against slavery. Well, why don't we have that in the Declaration? Because the Declaration, when they were doing this, John Hancock said we will only include in the Declaration what is unanimous among all the colonies. Because if we have disagreements in the Declaration, the king can come in and he can pull us apart by our own separate local interests. So we have to make sure we're fully unified. When this grievance was introduced before the Continental Congress, there were 2 states who said, you know, we don't really think we need to have that grievance in there because we haven't tried to end the slave trade. We haven't tried to end slavery in our states. So that's not a grievance we have. So we don't think that should be included. Those 2 states were Georgia and South Carolina. What is more significant, 11 of the 13 states agreed with it. That means the vast majority of America held the position that they were ready to end the slave trade and arguably end slavery, which after we separated from the king, every single northern state began passing laws to end slavery. By 1804, every single northern state had passed laws to abolish slavery. Nowhere else in the world had done that at that point. The northern states, the very first place anywhere in the world to abolish slavery. But let me just point out, see, we don't know the full story, and that's why today when we're telling people America's evil and America's awful, the only reason kids believe that is because they don't know the actual story. Let me back you up. Even, I'm gonna use the American Revolution as one example, but I could use a lot of examples. The American Revolution, if you look at the Revolution, generally we're taught the American Revolution began April 1775, right? This is when Paul Revere makes his famous midnight ride, right? Warning the Americans, the British are coming. Paul Revere was not the only guy that rode that night. We know William Dawes, among others, rode that night with Paul Revere. But every time the British were moving to a new town in a new colony, there were people riding in front of the British warning, the British are coming. There were lots of people who made these famous midnight rides. One of the guys who made a famous midnight ride, you see him down here in the bottom right corner on horseback, he is Wentworth Cheswell. Wentworth Cheswell was actually a black patriot, and what's significant about Wentworth Cheswell, he was actually an elected official. We have some of his original documents where he signed, this one he signs as Justice of the Peace. But what's crazy about Wentworth Cheswell, he served in public office for 49 years in a variety of different positions where he kept getting elected to different positions. Why is this important? Wentworth Cheswell lived in a white community. A black man was elected for 49 years in a white community. And he was not the first black man elected to public office in America. He's just one example of someone who actually was a pretty famous American. But let me back you up to Paul Revere. Paul Revere makes his famous midnight ride. As he's riding, he's actually looking specifically for John Hancock and Sam Adams. The reason was the king had ordered that those 2 guys be delivered to him, their bodies be delivered. So, right, kill them, bring them back was the idea. So Paul Revere writes to warn them, and actually, Paul Revere rode to the home of the Reverend Jonas Clark. Jonas Clark was known to be their mentor, known to be their friend. So Paul Revere rides to Jonas Clark's home. These two guys are both there. And he says, hey guys, the British are coming. Y'all need to get out of here. They're coming to kill you. Also, they're coming to seize our military supplies, our storehouse. Well, the next morning, more than 700 British showed up. And there were 73 Americans that showed up to oppose them on Lexington Green. Those 73 Americans, at the end of the shot heard around the world, 18 of them had been shot, right? 10 of them died, 8 of them wounded. But among the guys who were there, you had people like John Robbins, who was a white guy, and Prince Estabrook, who was a black guy. 73 guys together, they were all from one church. They were all from the church of the Reverend Jonas Clark, okay? What's also interesting, this is American Revolution period, but these are also northern states. See, the North and the South, even back then, there was a difference and disparity in their belief about people, about the created equal thoughts. Nonetheless, you have black and white people going to church back then together in Jonas Clark's church. Well, let me also point out, right? Prince Estabrook is the guy, one of the guys who was shot that day. They actually erected a monument acknowledging this black patriot's contribution, and they even have a monument there, a new monument there today at Lexington Green to acknowledge this was a black hero in the cause of liberty. Well, he wasn't the only one. In fact, I can point to every single major battle in American history, and especially the American Revolution specifically, and I can highlight the black heroes. The reason I can is because it was well documented who was there in the sense of who these guys were and what they did. Let me point to the next major excursion. You have just a month or two later, you have the Battle of Bunker Hill. The Battle of Bunker Hill, if you remember, this is where the British charged Hill the first time, the Americans repelled them. The British charged a second time, the Americans repelled them a second time. The third time, the Americans ran out of ammunition, the British take the hill, the Americans have to flee. But the hero of that battle is a guy over here on the right. His name is Peter Salem. He's standing behind a white guy named Thomas Grosvenor. Peter Salem, the hero of this battle, there actually were many paintings and lithographs done highlighting who he was. Now over here, right, very clearly, that is a black soldier. That is a black man over here on the side. Well, they even had color lithographs that were painted. And here is Peter Salem. The reason he was the hero is the third charge the British had when the Americans ran out of ammunition. They were about to be overwhelmed. There was one soldier who had a shot left. And that soldier upped his gun. He shot the commanding officer leading the charge. When he shot him, it was Major Pitcairn. When he shot Major Pitcairn goes down. The soldiers gather around Major Pitcairn, try to pick him up, make sure he's okay. And it delayed the charge enough that all the Americans were able to escape and get away. Peter Salem was credited with saving all of the Americans' lives who evacuated because he had stopped the officer leading the charge. He was the hero of the battle, and it was well documented. And he wasn't the only hero that day. There is another account of a guy named Salem Poor, and actually there is a document where 13 white officers signed this document encouraging the promotion of Salem Poor, because during that battle, he fought so bravely and incredibly that they said this man should be an officer leading other men. 13 white officers recommended this guy to promotion for an officer. Here's the point. Is I can go through battle after battle after battle and highlight all these black heroes. This isn't quite the same narrative that I've heard, right? This is a little different. And actually the 1619 Project, they say one of their objectives is they want to bring back the contribution of black Americans. I'm totally in favor of saying, let's bring back these stories. The problem is these individuals don't fit the narrative that the 1619 Project is largely promoting, and therefore they don't want to tell these stories. This is a big deal. Now, I could go through every major battle. Let me skip to the last battle of the American Revolution, the last major battle, 1781. This was the Battle of Yorktown. And during this battle, there were many famous generals involved in this battle. One of the American generals who was there was the French Major General Marquis de Lafayette. And Lafayette, while he was there, Washington had actually tasked Lafayette with tracking all of the movements of the British officers. And Lafayette said, okay, that's a big job. Lafayette developed a spy ring. And people today maybe have heard of like the Culper spy ring. We know there were some spy rings in the Revolution. There actually were many spy rings. One of the spy rings was led by Marquis de Lafayette. Lafayette's spy ring was composed primarily of black patriots. The reason was Lafayette said, well, these black patriots, they can pretend to be escaped slaves and they can go in the British camp, like seeking help and refuge. The British will take them in and then they can get all of the plans. They can just listen, right? What are they gonna do? Where they're gonna go? And they can come and report back. Well, the most famous spy who worked for Lafayette was a guy named James Armistead. James Armistead, his account is really remarkable. There's a lot of fun stories about him today, but let me just back you up and walk you through this. So James Armistead was from Richmond, Virginia. Richmond, Virginia, if you back up and remember, there was a famous American general, Benedict Arnold, who became the famous traitor, Benedict Arnold. When Benedict Arnold became a traitor, he actually then in January, he became a traitor in the fall of 1780. Then in January of 1781, he led the British attack on Richmond as a British general. When Richmond fell, James Armistead was in Virginia and in Richmond. At the time, James was also a slave. This is a big deal. James was a slave, but when Richmond fell, he said, I don't want to see the British destroy this nation. I don't want to see them win this war. He went to his master and said, I want to go serve. And the law of Virginia at the time said, if you serve for a year, you could have your freedom. His master knew that. He said, that's fine. You go and serve. So James goes to sign up. When Lafayette sees James coming, he says, hey, right now the British have a camp in Richmond. Benedict Arnold was the commander of that camp in Richmond, commander of the base in Richmond. And Lafayette told James, I want you to pretend to be an escaped slave, go to the camp and try to gather intel and information. So James Armistead, pretending to be an escaped slave, goes to the British camp, and actually while he's there, and you can imagine, right, how this unfolds, because the records talk about him going to the camp, and then it tells some details, but you have to fill in the gaps a little bit with what happened. But you can imagine he's in the camp, he's probably serving in the camp, just trying to get information, but what we do know is Benedict Arnold saw him serving. And Benedict Arnold was so impressed with how well he served the troops, Benedict Arnold said, a man like that shouldn't be serving the common soldier, he should be serving the officers. So Benedict Arnold brought James to serve in the officer's tent. So James now, on personal invitation, is serving in the officer's tent. He's hearing all the officer's plans, but he's doing a good job serving, right? He's playing the role, he's playing the game. So he's serving, and Benedict Arnold was so impressed with James, he made James his personal assistant. It gets better. Benedict Arnold gets reassigned, and Cornwallis actually calls. Cornwallis is the commander of all the British forces. Cornwallis calls Benedict Arnold to come serve in his camp. And so Benedict Arnold brought his personal assistant, James Armistead, with him. So James Armistead is now serving in the camp of Cornwallis, who's the commander of all the British forces. And when they have officers meeting, Benedict Arnold brings James into the officers meeting. And so James is hearing all of the details of all of the plans of the British. He's getting word back to Lafayette, who gets word to Washington. So the Americans now know where the British are going, they know what they're doing, and the Americans start to show up at the right place at the right time, and they start to actually win some of these encounters. In the midst of them winning some of these encounters, Lord Cornwallis knew something was wrong. He said, the Americans, they know all our plans. They have a spy in our camp. He called an officers meeting, all the officers in the tent. He said, one of you has loose lips. One of you is getting, I don't know who it is. He said, but one of you, and you need to find out who that man is who's getting word out, and we're gonna execute that man. Like we're done, we're not doing this. He's furious. He sends the officers out to go figure out who this spy is. When the officers go to leave, he kept James in the tent. James, you stay. Now, he just gave word he's gonna execute whoever the spy is, right? So, James, you can imagine you're a little nervous in this moment, so James stays. Well, as James stays in the tent, Arnold apparently says, James, I don't know who I can trust anymore. I know we have a spy. I don't know who it is. He said, I'm not even sure I can trust my officers anymore. He says, but I feel like you're the one guy I can count on. James has got to play the game, right? He's like, oh yes, sir, you can count on me, right? Like he's playing the game. Benedict Arnold says, James, the Americans are becoming a little more formidable than we thought. We need someone who will go to the American camp and who can spy on the Americans. He says, James, would you be willing? And again, James has to play the part, right? He's a spy. Right, so you can imagine, he's like, oh, sir, don't send me out. I say, oh, okay, for you, I'll do it. James is then sent as a spy for the British to the American camp. He is actually the first double spy in American history. The British think he is spying for them. He's actually spying for the Americans. Here's where it gets interesting. Lafayette, you can read his writings. There is a letter in 1781 in the spring. He writes Washington and says, remember I told you about that new spy I had in Cornwallis' camp who was the best spy I've ever had? He just got me word that Cornwallis is moving with several thousand men and they're going to Yorktown, Lafayette writes Washington, he says, this might be the very moment we've been waiting for to capture Cornwallis. Well, Washington gets that and says, absolutely, right? And so he makes this plan. We're gonna pretend like we're going north, become south. They surround Cornwallis at Yorktown. Well, they end up winning the Battle of Yorktown, where Cornwallis surrenders, and this was ultimately the end of the American Revolution because this was the surrender of the commander in charge of all the British forces. What is significant about this? How did Washington even know where to go? The reason this battle won was because of the intelligence work of a black patriot. Okay, here's what I want to point out. If you look at the story of the revolution, and in fact, let me even back up at the beginning. If you read John Adams' writings, John Adams, years after the revolution, looking back, he said, we have often told the revolution as if it began with a shot heard around the world of Lexington Green. He says, I don't think that's where it began. He said, I think the revolution actually began when the first blood was shed at King Street. King Street is where the Boston Massacre occurred, right? That's where the British first fired into Americans, and that was the first blood shed, and what John Adams says, that was the beginning of the cause of liberty. Let me point out, who was the first person killed at the Boston Massacre? Crispus Attucks. The American Revolution, according to John Adams, began with the death of a black patriot, and the American Revolution was won because of the intelligence work of a black patriot. You can't even tell the story of America and the Revolution without including the contributions of these black patriots. But here's what I want to point out and why the education system matters. Why don't we know these stories today? There's actually one culprit largely responsible. That man is Woodrow Wilson. If you don't know a lot about Woodrow Wilson, the most important thing to know is he's really bad, okay? That's the most important thing to know. This dude was very evil on a lot of levels. Okay, but in 1902, he was a professor. And as a professor, he wrote a history series. It was a 5-volume history set called The History of the American People. And this was such a popular history set that he actually then got recruited to be the president of a university. And he was actually the first president of Princeton University who was not a pastor, because Princeton, like most major universities back then, were started as Bible colleges. So he's the first president who wasn't a pastor, but he's now the president of Princeton. And from there, he actually gets recruited to run for the White House as president because they said, we need someone as smart as this guy to be the president. It's worth noting, Woodrow Wilson was an incredibly racist guy. When World War I started, at that time, the military was not a segregated military, because at the end of the Civil War, you had black and white soldiers fighting together on the Union side, and actually for the rest of the conflicts we had leading up to World War I, we had a military that was a unified military, and Wilson in World War I says, nope, we need to come in and we need to segregate this military. We need to divide the black and white soldiers. Wilson was an incredible racist. In fact, under Wilson was the rebirth of the KKK. Wilson's administration actually marched openly in the KKK marches in Washington, D.C. Wilson showed the very first ever film in the White House, gave it 2 viewings, and it was A History of the American People, which was a recruiting film for the KKK. Okay, Wilson is the guy doing this as president. I'm giving this so that you have a little context of who Wilson was, and no, he really wasn't a good guy. The reason I bring that up is because it's visible in his history books as well. See, if you go back to his history book, and the reason this matters, Woodrow Wilson, after becoming president, the progressives are taking over a lot, and education being one of those things, and they said, you know what, Woodrow Wilson, this brilliant progressive thought leader, wrote this great history book. We should use that in public schools. Woodrow Wilson's 5-volume history set became the basis of history in public schools in America, and really it's even shaped all the way forward to where we are today. His influence has shaped it. What matters about his history book is he removed every single black person from American history. There's not a single mention of a single black person in his textbook. Let me point out, he wrote this in 1902. You understand Frederick Douglass, Civil War era, right? Frederick Douglass was photographed more times than Abraham Lincoln. Frederick Douglass was one of the most famous people in America, not to mention Booker T. Washington, George Washington Carver. You had a lot of really incredible famous people, but Woodrow Wilson said, yeah, we don't need to include any of those people. But in his book, he says, now there are other people that do exist apart from white people. He said, and if you happen to see those people, he actually gave pictures of these lesser people. In his books he described, and the pictures of lesser people, if you have seen the sequence of evolution, right? From like goo to you, right? And you go through the Neanderthal phase coming forward, this is exactly what Woodrow Wilson did in his history book. Now, let me also point out, Why in the world would Woodrow Wilson put something so racist in his history book? And not to be too offensive, but let me just point out, he was just following the science. Why? Because who was the leading scientist of the day? Charles Darwin. Not Fauci, it's a good guess. Okay. Charles Darwin. Okay. Charles Darwin in his famous book, Origin of Species, right? Most people only know his book by that short title, Origin of Species. That was actually not the full title of his book. It was Origin of Species by means of natural selection or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. Favored races? Darwin actually wrote and argued that the darker someone's skin, the less evolved they are. He was in favor of recolonization, saying take all people who are dark-skinned, send them off the continent, and don't let anybody back on who's not white, because those are the people who are fully evolved. Okay, we are in an era where we have people and movements who want to cancel all the racists from American history. Let me just offer up someone that would be worthy of being canceled for his position, right? This is exactly where Woodrow Wilson came from, but let me point out, Woodrow Wilson is the guy who shaped public school education with American history in the progressive era coming forward. There was a reason we didn't know about this, which is why even on African American, like Black History Month, every February, right? Who do we celebrate? Well, MLK, Rosa Parks, Frederick Douglass, right? George Washington Carver, Booker T. Washington. Like there's only a handful of people that are known. I can actually go through American history and I can give you hundreds of Black heroes that today nobody knows. Why? Largely because of the progressive takeover, the progressive racist takeover. And I'm gonna say something that's historical and accurate, and you're gonna think it's political. I'm just saying what is historically accurate and true. When you see incredibly racist things that happened in American history, they were largely contributed to and promoted by white Democratic presidents. Okay? I am not necessarily just slamming one party. However, this is what we see. And actually, like where we are today, right? From the 1619 Project, they say, yeah, but America was founded on slavery. And like the reason we exist is slavery. We promote slavery. All these ideas out there today, okay? These are articles that are talking about how evil America is because of slavery. What is crazy, it's not just that people are saying America participated in slavery. You had US Senator, Democrat Senator Tim Kaine, who says America created slavery. We didn't inherit it from anybody. We created it. He acknowledges, he says that he is a Catholic, a practicing Catholic. I will point out, Catholics believe in the Bible. If you go to Genesis, there was this boy in Genesis named Joseph, had this coat of many colors, right? His brothers actually sold him into something. Slavery. Second book of the Bible was Exodus. Moses delivered the Israelites out of slavery. Pretty sure that's before America, right? By the way, let's say Tim Kaine doesn't know the Bible. Fine. How bad was your world history teacher? Right? You never learned about the Greeks or the Romans. Like, guys, this is crazy. Here's what I want to point out. America did have slavery. There's no question. We had slavery. Let me give you a few facts though. See, America was never a world leader in the global slave trade. Slavery was a global condition and America was never a leader. In fact, if you look at the African slave trade, lasted for almost 400 years, 1501 to 1875. There was approximately 12.7 million slaves taken out of Africa. They've actually been able to document all the ships that were involved and where those ships went, and they can document where those slaves went and to what nations. And here's what they've identified. And again, this is not even historically argued or debated, it's just not taught. Okay, so these numbers aren't really disputed, it's just people don't know them. Let me just give you some numbers. So of these slaves coming out of Africa, 43% went to Portugal and Brazil and their holdings, 24% went to Great Britain, 15% went to Spain, 11% went to France, 5% went to the Dutch, 2.5% went to the United States, and 1% went to Denmark. Okay, what that means, America absolutely participated in this great evil. But America was nowhere near a leader in this great evil. Okay, and let me go even more than that. See, we pretend like America is the only nation that did this. No. Every nation in the history of the world participated in slavery on some level. What is unique about America though, is America was the very first nation in the history of the world to pass a law banning the slave trade. America did it on March 2nd, 1807. England was the second nation. They did it on March 25th, 1807. America is the very first nation in the world to sign a law banning the slave trade. America was the fourth major nation in the history of the world to actually end slavery. Happened in December 1865 with the 13th Amendment. England did it in 1833, then Denmark, then France, then America. What is also worth noting, when America ended slavery, America is the only nation in the world that not only fought a war to free the slaves, it's the only nation in the world where white people fought a war against other white people to free all the black people. And it cost more than 650,000 lives in the midst of the Civil War. See, America paid a higher price than anywhere else in the world to end the slavery. And if you look at the world today, hopefully we're not so ignorant that we don't recognize like slavery still exists today. Right? It's still a real thing in the world today. China, we know there's more than 3 million of the Uyghur Muslims who are enslaved in China. And in Africa, there's more than 9.2 million slaves in Africa. Like literally, we can go around the world, but why is slavery still in the world today? Because if you look at the United Nations, 94 of those nations still have not passed laws banning slavery in their nations. Slavery is actually illegal in 94 nations of the world. Now, that doesn't mean that all 94 nations are currently practicing slavery, but they haven't criminalized slavery. See, we pretend like America is the one doing all this evil. Let me point out, this is a map. By the way, there's approximately more than 40 million people enslaved in the world today, but this is a map showing where slavery still exists, and it shows the nations who actually are some of the worst perpetuators of this, and nations who are doing the most to try to stop it. And if you can see this little gray graph or gray line down here at the bottom, these are the nations doing the most. Number one is the Netherlands, and number two is the United States of America. Now, the Netherlands are doing most by percentage. America is doing the most by volume, and it's not even close. America does more than any other nation in the world to fight modern day slavery, human trafficking, sex slavery. Nobody does more than America does today, and here's what's worth noting. See, when you look at America, America actually started legal opposition to slavery before any other nation in the world. America paid a higher price in ending slavery than any other nation in the history of the world, and America does more today than virtually any other nation in the world to oppose slavery. On top of that, if you look at the history of our nation, I would argue America never could have become America without the contributions of black patriots, which today are largely ignored. And I've only given a couple examples. I literally give hundreds of examples. Here's the reason I bring all this up. We are not being honest in the story we are telling about America. And that's why today so many young people think that America is the great evil of the world. Okay, America's not perfect. Unquestionably, we're not perfect. But America's not guilty of most of the crimes she's accused of today. And what I would point you to is when you look at America, America is not the story of a perfect nation or perfect people, but it is a story of how a perfect God used imperfect people and did really special things in this nation that actually have made the world a better place. America has been the greatest force for good the world has ever known. Okay, that is America. Now, with all that being said, I've made a lot of claims. I will point out, we have a book called The American Story, where we have more than 1,000 footnotes detailing a lot of these events. I told you, don't take my word for it. Go look it up, do research. This is a book that has a lot of those stories. On our website, we have a lot more information. But here's the point. Our culture is struggling today largely over a debate of what's true, what's not true. Is America good, is America bad? We have to be people that fight to restore and recover truth. Because if we cannot define, if we cannot agree on what is true or even be honest about what is true, then our nation will never be able to come back together again. And this is one of the things that's so important, even about you guys showing up tonight and wanting to get involved and do something. I am not defending America saying we never did bad things. I'm just saying, let's be honest about it, right? America, like every nation, is imperfect. But America fought to overcome those imperfections faster than virtually any other nation and has done a better job than virtually any other nation. Now, again, I know our sins and I can describe them very, very well in great detail. I'm not denying that, but I'm saying we need to stop lying, and especially lying to our kids about what America is and teaching them, right, that socialism or Marxism or communism are better ways of life. We have to stand up to fight and defend truth. Thank you guys for letting me share, and I'll turn it back over to whoever needs it.
Thank you. That was amazing. And I'll just give you a little plug because I just finished The American Story. And some of those stories that Tim told tonight are in that book. So if you want to hear more, and it's just so well written, and so, I'm a former teacher, I like to see documentation, and it's there. So thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, just quick announcement. If you have your kids in childcare, it ends at 8:30. So just make sure that you can slip by and pick your kiddos up. All right, we have a few minutes left. We might go over a little bit today or tonight. But if you have a question, you know how we do it. We just have people line up, make a line right here, and you can come up and ask a question. Let me remind you, this is not commentary. We just had a lot of that. So this is question time. So if you have a question, make your way up.
Or if you've heard me talk enough, that's okay too.
Wow.
I've already said all that needs to be said. It's perfect.
Okay, here they come.
Okay. Hi, my name is Mike. Appreciate you being here with us. I have a question real quick. I know that your father and yourself have a place in Texas that we can go visit and see all these historic documents. Is it open, and when can I go see it?
Yeah, great question. So we actually do, as Mike mentioned, we have a facility in Texas where we do allow people to come and see these artifacts. So there's actually two locations. There's one in Dallas with Mercury One that is open right now. The one west of Fort Worth is under renovation, but it should be open probably by Christmas time. But if you go to wallbuilders.com, you can actually schedule a tour, and we do it by schedule. So if you show up, we'll say, hey, glad to see you. Come back again another time when you schedule it. So we have to schedule those because that way we have a staff member take people through. We don't just turn them loose with our old documents, but we want to have somebody there to walk you through and tell those stories so you can see it. And we are totally open to you holding and experiencing. We have so many cool things from American history. We'd love you to come visit. But in basically Dallas, Texas, you can find out a lot of information on the Wall Builders website though. So wallbuilders.com.
Thank you. All right, and I just was reminded that this was recorded tonight, so you can watch this online.
Hi, my name is Valerie Ritchie. My question is, what would be the end game for all of these politicians to change our culture or deconstruct? And I know it's happening. I'm just saying though, like the people in charge, the top, they're gonna be subject to socialism as well, right? So I don't understand why they would want that.
It's a really fair question. So there's two components to it. In life, you generally deal with two kinds of people, the intentional and the ignorant. And the ignorant just don't know what's true, and they will be led by what they feel or believe or think, not necessarily what's true. The intentional know what's true, and they don't really care what's true. I think there are both. I think there are some politicians who have no clue whatsoever, and they've just been taught that these are good ideas and they promote those because they think it's good. There are some politicians who definitely know, but in socialism, not everybody's equal. Okay, in socialism, there is a zoo and there is a zookeeper, right? Where the zookeeper has to take care of these animals who are too dumb to care for themselves. That's the government, right? The government is the zookeeper of the animals in the zoo. And so as long as you are a politician in socialism, you're not living like everybody else. Right? They're the zookeeper in this scenario. And so we see a lot of people that pursue power, that pursue, in lots of forms, right? Money, whatever else. But that's where a lot of politicians are. Where a lot of politicians, we can identify people who have been there for 30, 40, nearly 50 years, that when they entered, they were low middle class, and now they're millionaires on lots of levels. Like how? There's a lot of corruption involved. And they don't mind promoting ideas that help keep them in an elevated position of power and actually make people be subservient to them, which is actually what happens for the leaders in socialism.
So I just find it hard to believe there are that many, for lack of a better word, peons that are going to go along with this. I mean, we have educators that are going along with this. They're not dumb.
So there's a lot of challenges with this, right? So you had Terry McAuliffe in Virginia, right, who says that parents are not capable of handling their kids' education. They shouldn't even have a say in their kids' education. You have a lot of teachers who agree with that. You have a lot of teachers that think parents are too dumb to know how to raise their own kids. Okay? And let me clarify. There are a lot of good teachers in public schools. I have family in public schools who are teachers, principals, superintendents. There's some really great people. However, the system itself is very broken. Right? It's one of the great things when COVID happened and there was a shutdown and parents for the first time are seeing what their kids are learning and they're like, hold up, this is ridiculous, right? That was a very beneficial thing because most parents had the faulty assumption I mean, when I went to school, it wasn't that bad. It can't be that bad now. They didn't have any idea what their kids were learning. And when they saw firsthand, it shocked them out of complacency. The problem is, when they were shocked out of complacency, like we're seeing this at school board meetings where, right, the school board is on this pedestal and you little peons below me, you don't know anything, you don't deserve to speak or whatever. Like, it's crazy. This is part of that pedagogy of the hierarchy in academics, where people think, right, if they're in this position or if they have like whatever credentials, well, you didn't go to school to be a teacher, you don't know, whatever. Right? It's ridiculous. That's where it is. People are not gonna put up with it, but there is gonna be a fight. And let me back up. So one of the things I was gonna say is there's a lot of really good teachers involved in this system, but one of the things we have seen is a lot of parents are now recognizing the brokenness of the system. And that's why in the last year, homeschooling went from 5% of the nation to 15% of the nation. Right? Christian schools are at an increase. Charter schools are at an increase. Private schools are increasing because we see the brokenness of the public school system. And again, I don't mean to belittle the really good teachers who are in the public school system, but saying there are really good teachers in the public school system is kind of like saying the band on the Titanic was really good. They're not stopping the ship from going down.
Hi, my name is Denise, and I can pretty confidently say that probably everybody in this room learned something new tonight. Given that your family is so invested in the Constitution, our founding fathers, everything this nation was born to be and to do, has your family ever thought about taking this information and creating educational curriculum for schools across the nation? Because our kids need to know this.
So we actually are in the middle of different curriculums right now. We have a government curriculum that we're finalizing. There's already in beta form, so there's already schools using it. The challenge is, generally you're gonna have Christian schools or home schools that will use it, right now, we are in such a politically polarized place that for a lot of public schools, right, if you're a conservative, you're a Christian, right, if you're whatever, well then we can't use your content because you have these faulty positions. So we're largely not accepted in most public school settings, right, most teachers unions, et cetera, but we do have curriculum that is utilized by homeschoolers, by Christian schools, and like even the book that we mentioned, The American Story, we're actually working to turn that into a curriculum. We're gonna have a second and third volume as well. So we recognize the need and we are working that direction to try to make that available. Again, it's gonna be limited to who actually is gonna utilize that, because we're unapologetic in the way we present it, and we present it with the reality that there is a God, and God does involve himself in the affairs of men, right? And we can show that historically so evidently. The American Revolution, right? You have the Battle of Long Island, where the fog, it's like so many crazy stories that don't make sense unless there's a God. So we acknowledge like there must have been a God in this moment, because this would make no sense other way, and we will actually use quotes from the soldiers who were there, the generals who were there, like Washington, talking about that moment where they recognized the hand of divine providence. None of that's really welcome in public schools, right? So that's where there's some of the battle, is even though we can show this is historically documented information, there's a lot of people that they don't care what's true, right? They care about an agenda, and if this doesn't fit the agenda, then I don't want that in my school, and that's where the bigger challenge is.
I have just one follow-up question. I mean, is there a way, do you think, this is just your thought process, could parents of public schools petition to have your materials in place because of the authenticity and the truth and based on actual quotes and documents?
So this is one of the big deals about parents getting involved in the school board, and actually people controlling a school board of a different ideology. Because actually, school board can approve different curriculums for their school district, right? For their schools. They can say, hey, now in some states, a state board of education has to approve like overarching, and it's got to meet certain right standards for the state. But if it meets those standards, the school district can actually choose different curriculums used in that school district. But that's where parents have to be involved in the school board, whatever else. We actually do teachers conferences in the summer as well. So we have a lot of teachers from public schools who come to our conference in the summer to get equipped and learn this information, because there's Supreme Court cases that actually defend the fact that you can teach any history from American history, if you're an American history teacher, as long as you are supporting it with original firsthand documents. So they can teach all the Christian heritage they want if they're doing it through original documents, which we can show them where those are and how to utilize those. And that's the same thing that parents on a school board, if they have the school board, they can say, hey, we want to make sure right now it is federal law that every September 17th, which is Constitution Day, that week, every single public school in America, federal law, every public school in America is required to teach the Constitution that week to their students. How many schools do that? Less than 1%, right? And I mean, I think it's way less than 1%, but when parents get involved, they can turn that around.
Hi, my name is Cheryl, and I want to thank you for being here, and thanks to your father and family for the Constitution Live course that I would say a lot of us here have participated in and really appreciate and have learned a lot
Awesome,
from.
thank you.
So my question is about the Founder's Bible. I've heard reference to it a couple of times, and I'd like to know more about that. I think you have it available through your company, but
yes,
I'd like to know more about that.
Sure, so on the Wall Brothers website, you can find it, but the Founder's Bible is a Bible that we've been collecting original documents from the Founding Fathers for literally decades, and we've made note of where the Founding Fathers would talk about how the Bible shaped what they did in public policy or education or whatever the law might be. And so in the Founder's Bible, hey, thank you. In the Founder's Bible, we actually go through, and whenever they talked about how they used a verse to shape what they did in government or education or public policy, we actually put that quote by that verse. So as you read the Bible, which is the first thing I'd recommend, everybody read the Bible, but as you read the Bible, what's great is as you're reading the Bible, you can literally see how the Founding Fathers said those verses or the Bible itself literally was shaping what they were doing. So the Founder's Bible is a really fun way, not just to study and learn more from the Bible, but to see how the Bible directly applied to American history from the founders' own writings themselves. So that's what the Founder's Bible really is.
Brina, just want to thank you for coming. It is an honor that you came down here to Colorado.
Thank you.
My question is kind of shifting a little bit. Is there anything an American citizens can do about the Marxist indoctrination of our military that has been going on for quite some time, unfortunately, but that's a very frightening thing, that our own military would be turned against our whole founding?
Yeah, so probably in the room, not only is there probably active duty, there's probably a lot of retired military. You probably have a lot of thoughts on this as well. And so I might be less qualified to speak to this than other people in the room, but I would acknowledge that what we know from the military in general, there are so many good people in the military. There are definitely some people in the military who are not good, but if God forbid, right, some president one day says to the military, you go and fire on the American people, the majority of the military would quickly join the side of the American people to oppose the tyranny that was being directed at the American people. So the challenge is, right, you have new recruits coming in that are being taught critical race theory, that are being taught this racist indoctrination. And so the challenge is, right, in several generations, is the military still gonna be in the same place it is now, where people recognize what the Constitution is, what the Bill of Rights is, and that's a violation, and we'd never do that to the American people? That's a different question. And there is a cause for concern, but I will tell you, I am super optimistic about the future of the nation, not immediately. I think it's gonna get worse probably before it gets better, but I'm optimistic because I travel all over the nation. My dad right now is on a tour all around the nation, and we are seeing people all over the nation who God is stirring to stand up, and people who've never been involved or maybe actually had political leanings that were opposite, but they're seeing the tyranny right now. And for some people who voted for Joe Biden because they wanted normalcy, they're seeing this and going, this ain't normal, right? This is not what we thought we were getting. And God is just stirring and awakening so many people that I am very hopeful and optimistic for the direction of our nation in the future. Again, I think it's gonna get worse before it gets better because there's a lot of people in big tech and big corporations and bureaucracies who are gonna fight tooth and nail against the change, but they're gonna be overwhelmed by the sheer number of the normal, everyday, average, right, whoever God raises up that are standing up against this. I'm very encouraged because God's waking people up all over the nation.
Hi there, thanks for coming out to Colorado. I was wondering, one often hears the faith of the founders characterized as kind of deist. I was wondering how prevalent deism was among the founders and what some of the key characteristics of that were, if it was kind of a moderated deism.
Yeah, so really good question. So what's probably a little more accurate is to say that not every single founding father was a Christian. However, the vast majority in their own writings profess Christianity. They actually attended Orthodox church, whether it be Anglican, Episcopal, Congregationalist, Baptist, whatever else. What's interesting is the guy today who's considered the least religious founding father, Benjamin Franklin, okay? Benjamin Franklin is considered one of the deist founding fathers. Why do we think he's a deist? People say, well, he wrote he was a deist. Okay, where did he write it? He wrote it in his autobiography. And I say, yes, Have you read it? Most people are like, no, I haven't read it. I say, okay, go read the page where he says he was a deist, and then read 2 sentences after he said he was a deist, what he says next. Because he said when he was very young, he actually embraced deism, thinking that that made the most sense. He said, however, he quickly discovered that even though there might be some truths to this thought, he said it was of no benefit to me or anybody else, so I quickly left that thought behind. Okay, now that was early in his life. If you look later in his life, one of the things he does as a leader in Pennsylvania, he helps write the state constitution of Pennsylvania. And actually, in the original state constitution of Pennsylvania, you can go look it up. The part where someone is going to be elected to office, they have to swear a certain phrase, like they agree, right? Kind of like if you uphold or you swear to uphold the Constitution, right? Whatever. In Pennsylvania, they had a certain phrase you had to swear that you agreed to, or you could not be elected to public office in Pennsylvania. Benjamin Franklin wrote it. The phrase was, you must subscribe to the following declaration, viz. I do believe in one God, the creator of heaven and earth, the rewarder of the good, the punisher of the wicked, right? Now, that still could be, well, maybe that's a deist because, right, he's not really like, no, he continued. He said, and he has given us the Old and New Testament of divine revelation to be used for our daily life. Okay? Franklin, if you actually read his autobiography, there are dozens of accounts where he talked about the hand of providence has guided and led me in this decision. If you're a deist, you don't believe providence guides and leads you because they're uninvolved. Franklin is the least religious founding father, and his writings are full of the thought that God was helping or directing or leading him in what he did. I wouldn't argue Franklin was a Christian, but Franklin was closer to maybe like an Orthodox Jew because he believed in the God of the Bible, a God of miracles. He just wasn't sure about the divinity of Jesus, which actually there was a letter at the very end of his life. There was a pastor who wrote him and said, hey, what do you think about Jesus? And Franklin said, I've actually never studied really to know if he was divine or not. And actually Franklin died like 2 months later. So in this letter he says, but I'm very old. I will soon discover if Jesus truly was divine. He says, but what I do know is that there is a God. I know that God rewards the good and punishes the wicked, that he made the whole universe. He gave us the Bible. And I do believe Jesus was a real man and he gave us the best system of morals the world has ever known. And we would be better off by living by his teachings. Franklin just wasn't sure Jesus was truly the Son of God. Okay, now it's also true that was 2 months before he died. And it's very true that like in the last 2 months, maybe the Holy Spirit was like, hey, you should investigate this Jesus guy, right? It's totally possible that Franklin in the last 2 months of his life got saved and we'll see him in heaven. That's totally possible. But up to that point, I believe, right, because Jesus said in John 14:6, no man comes to the Father except through me. If you don't believe in Jesus, you're not going to the Father, right? I think that's pretty basic Christianity. So I would say, I don't think Franklin, we can have any evidence he was saved. However, he's the least religious founding father, and he was not anti-God, anti-Jesus, anti-Christian, or anti-Bible. And that's usually what people try to do is demean the founding fathers in faith and say, well, they were all deists. Name the deist for me. Because even Franklin himself said he was only a deist for like a day and a half, right? No other founding father claimed to be a deist, none. Does that make sense? Absolutely. There's a ton of stuff on our website too. It's 8:30, by the way. If you have kids, just heads up. Thanks for coming, get your kids, see you later.
What portion of your 163,000, whatever it is, documents are available online?
Several thousand. We actually are in the process of trying to digitize more of those. But we have several thousand available on our website. So things like prayer proclamations, things like original sermons, original letters, some of their journals. So on the website, we have a section for original sources, and there's a tab that will pull down. And so some of the original sources, there's a tab like for Black history. So some of the stories there, we have some of those original documents from those guys. So you can actually search by topic, by category. We have links, actually some of the stuff that we haven't digitized, but like links to the writings of Washington or Adams or Jefferson. So on our website, there's a ton of information and several thousand of things that we've personally scanned, uploaded high-res images so you can see the image. And if it's a document, we try to transcribe it and put it by the document in case their shaky hand cursive is a little hard to read.
Does that include like this latest document you mentioned about Benjamin Franklin's?
So those are in his writings, which we do have a link to Franklin's writings on our website, but we don't have those original documents. Those are just in the writings of Franklin.
Last question.
Hi. I have a 30-year-old daughter, and she told me she recently met a guy who is a communist in America.
Sure.
And she asked him, what is your basis for being a communist? And he said, well, it's worked in Russia. So I really didn't know.
He needs to go there.
Yeah, I was thinking one-way ticket. But I was just curious, what would be your best rebuttal, like a simple rebuttal of why that's a terrible idea?
So the challenge is you can't convince someone they're wrong until they've discovered it themselves. So generally what I encourage is when someone makes a statement, the impetus is not on me to prove they're wrong, the impetus is on them to prove they're right because they made the statement, right? So if he says, hey, it's worked in Russia, I would ask, so what's been really good in Russia, right? Because one of the things we know to be true in socialism, Marxism, and communism, consistently, any nation that has embraced those things, the two things that's decreased every single time is personal freedom and personal wealth. Every single college kid, right? And I'm saying college kid, it could be anybody in general, right? But college kids is very easy. High school kids, hey, do you want to have a lot of money? Yes. Like, wouldn't it be cool to buy these things? And like, you talking about money, like, yes, I want to be really rich one day. That'd be awesome, right? Give me the salary of some of these professional athletes. I want that salary. You talking about freedom. And don't you love that we get to choose to do whatever we want? I would then ask, once we've established we like money, we like freedom, can you name any nation that once they embraced socialism, communism, or Marxism, it increased people's freedom or prosperity? It's never happened in the history of the world. So if those are things we like, are you willing to give those up to be communists, right? Like, what is better in communism that you think is a give-off trade worthy of trading freedom and prosperity for? Because I haven't found a trade-off that I think is worthy of trading off freedom and prosperity. I like both those things and I want more of both those things. So that's usually where I go, but I try to help them discover it first, and I try to put them in a position where they have to defend their position. It's really not a very defensible position, but most of them have never been challenged to defend their position, right? So what's so great about communism? Everybody's treated equal. Are they? Right? I mean, any statement they make, I'm gonna have them defend that statement because generally the statement's gonna be dumb and not true. They just don't know that because they've never been asked to defend that, right? And this is where you generally are dealing with more ignorant people than intentional because they're just repeating what they've been told, right? Some professor told this kid, or right, CNN or whatever news outlet they're watching, right? The Young Turks, somebody told them the communism's awesome. They're only repeating what they've heard. They've never had to defend it. And asking questions puts people in the position of having to actually think through and then clearly articulate why they think that's the best position. And when they realize that that's not a sustainable position, then it's easier to lead them to what is a better position. But they have to discover their position is false before they will embrace a new position. Yep. Does that make sense?
Well said. Can we say thank you again to Tim?